Please welcome David Kelley.
Thank you. All right, today I'm going to continue what we discussed yesterday, the broad topic of perceiving causality. In the lecture yesterday, I won't summarize the whole thing, but I introduced the phenomenon that we perceive not only objects and their attributes, but also actions, the way things act, move, change, in all the different varieties of action that there are in the world. And I pointed out that this plays into two broader philosophical issues. One is the analysis of perception itself, perceptual epistemology. What are we doing when we perceive? How do we deal with illusions, and so forth? And secondly, it plays into the traditional problem of induction. How do we justify generalizations about things, all of which are based in one way or another on causal connections between events, between the way things act and between the nature of a thing and the way it acts. And we I gave you the foundations for the very general principle, actually an axiomatic principle of the law of causality, which says that events have causes, actions are dependent phenomena metaphysically. They depend on the entities that act, and that they depend specifically on the nature of the thing that acts, and in such a way that once we know what it is about a thing that leads it to act in a certain way, we can be confident that the same thing in the same conditions will always act in the same way. Now that's a very broad principle. The problem now is how do we isolate which particular attribute of a thing is what is responsible for the way it acts, for the particular kind of action that we have observed the entity engaged in. When we observe something acting, we know that the action depends on the entity. Okay? So we see a thing, we see it acting a certain way, we know that it's that thing acting, and the action depends on what it is. But what specific aspect of the thing is responsible for what we do? So we need to discover the particular capacity in the thing, the particular feature or quality or relationship or whatever it may be that is specifically responsible for the effect. We observe salt dissolving in water. Okay, but which of the features of salt? So automatically we know that salt is soluble, and we can generalize right away. This potentiality to dissolve in water is common to salt. But what gives it its solubility? Is it the color? Is it the temperature? Is it the room in the house, or which way your kitchen faces, and which way the sun is slanting in? You have to isolate, you have to engage in a further process of inquiry to find out what it is that causes the particular action, just as the law of identity tells us that a thing is something, but what it is we have to find out by actually looking and investigating. Okay, so that's what I want to do today, is to move on excuse me, to that issue. And so let's talk about first of all, the standard inductive methods that are used to isolate the relevant factors that are responsible for an effect. The method is, you found it in any logic book. If you want a recommendation for a logic book, I can give you one. I have a pretty good one that I'm actually going to get even better in about 2 years when I finish the revisions. This is a standard method. It was first, the elements of it were first put forward by Francis Bacon. They were systematized and given their current name by John Stuart Mill. Actually, the name is Mill's Methods. Mill didn't call them Mill's Methods, but everyone since has called them that way. So let's just take a quick look at what those are. in a very schematic way. I'll talk about 3 of them. There are a few more, but these are the standard ones. The method of agreement is a method of comparing different cases that are similar in which we find one factor in common, but the other factors are different. For example, a standard thing in epidemiology is we find that a group of people who have come down with this food poisoning. Well, what do they have in common? A little investigation, we find out that they all ate at Frankie and Johnny's last night. Okay, but not everyone who ate there. So we have to figure out, did they all have the same dish? Okay, so we do our research and we find that, yeah, they all had the French fries. Okay, now that's factor A. That's the common factor in these, among each person is one case. The French fries are factor A. The other stuff they ate or drank or what they were wearing, how old they are, what sex they are, all these are the variable factors, B, C, D, F, G, and H. Well, if we find this pattern, then we have good reason to believe that it was the French fries that caused the food poisoning. And you see how closely this bears out the principle of the law of causality. The food poisoning must have been caused by something. Whatever it was caused by must be something that will have that effect in the same in each instance, unless there are counteracting factors, of course. And here we find that we know that A is at least a sufficient cause for, or we have reason to believe it's at least a sufficient condition for the food poisoning. The method of difference is, in some ways, just the opposite. You have you compare cases that are identical except for the presence or absence of a given factor, and if the effect occurs when that factor is present but does not occur when that factor is not present, that's what the tilde in front of the second E there, that's a negation sign in logic. The effect does not occur. Then we have reason to believe that A is at least a necessary condition because the effect doesn't occur in its absence. So for example, I'm standing outside on my terrace and I'm getting twilight on a summer night and I'm getting chewed up by mosquitoes. Okay, I come inside, I put on some mosquito repellent, and I go back outside. So the two cases differ only in the presence or absence of the mosquito. Otherwise, it's the same terrace, same night, same temperature, and I'm the same old boy I was a few minutes ago. But the mosquitoes stop biting. Okay, this is a negative effect. With the repellent, that's factor A, we get the negative effect, no bites, and with without the repellent, we get its opposite, bites. And thirdly, the method called concomitant variations, in which which turns not on the presence or absence of a given factor, but we keep everything constant except for the degree of the factor that we're testing. If we increase factor A and the effect increases in quantity or decreases, it can be an inverse relationship, it can be a square relationship, whatever, but the point is it increases, moves in one direction, and if we decrease A, the effect declines or increases accordingly in a quantitative sense. Now these three things are so simple that as soon as even my undergraduate students, as soon as I laid this out, they say, "Oh yeah, why'd you have to tell me this?" We all do this almost instinctively, implicitly, for sure. But the interesting thing is that this is a pretty good identification of a logical method that is employed from the simplest cases, like the examples I've been using, all the way up to experiments in particle physics or economic claims or politico-economic claims. Like, for example, yesterday, Michael Shermer mentioned the difference between North and South Korea. That's a standard classical example. North Korea, South Korea, same people, same culture, roughly the same geography and weather and everything else, but North Korea is poor and South Korea is wealthy. And what's the difference? Well, one's a communist dictatorship and the other one is at least semi-free country, capitalist country. So that's just a method of difference. However, there are a couple things, philosophical points that I want to make about this. I've already pointed out that these reflect the underlying principle of the law of causality. Many philosophers and many people who write about induction say that the method of induction, you have to gather instances. You have to put together a sample and observe the same feature in a number of instances, and then you generalize to the whole class with some degree of probability. And it's often assumed kind of implicitly that it's the repetition of one example after another. I drop an egg, it breaks. I drop another egg, it breaks. Okay, all eggs break. Now, in the use of Mill's methods, we also have different cases. But the logic of the method is not that we're repeating exactly the same case. We're systematically varying the cases to isolate one factor through difference, agreement, and variations. And so each of these experiments is itself one particular. We have one structured set of comparisons made up by case 1, 2, and 3 in the case of agreement, or however many we have. And from that one case, we then generalize to the universal principle. Because if the experiment was done properly, isolating, we have one set of particulars that we have in the lab or in our data set, and it's not. We're not treating them as just one thing, another thing, exactly identical, a third, a fourth, and so on. From which we say, gee, I wonder if there's some, if this is more than coincidence that all these things that have this one property act in the same way. No, we are setting up a structured set of comparisons, whether we design it experimentally ourselves or whether we use natural experiments or contrasts that we find in the world, like North and South Korea. And from that one experiment, we can generalize right away. What entitles us to do that is the law of causality. Because once we have established in a single case, or this case, a set of cases, that factor A was the cause, then we know that all A's will act in manner E. A second point I want to mention about this is that this is an inferential way of establishing causality, even within the one particular set of cases that we have set up. The method applies at all levels of science, from the observable examples, from the examples of things we can observe, like mosquitoes biting and repellent, or people getting sick and the food that they ate, all the way up to experiments about things that cannot be perceived, like subatomic particles. But even in the perceptual cases, nothing turns on whether or not we perceive causality. We don't actually, the arrow there is not another player. It's an indication that the effect occurs or doesn't occur. So that even whether or not we can perceive literally perceive causality, that is, perceive the causal connection over and above the action, the effect, it doesn't matter here. What makes this work is the presence or absence of certain factors and the presence or absence, the occurrence or non-occurrence of the effect. But now let us go on to ask that question. The reason I make this point and emphasize it is that the validity of induction, I don't think, depends specifically on the issue of whether we literally perceive a causal connection. As long as we perceive things and perceive their actions and have the modest logical sophistication to recognize the implications of these contrasting cases under one of Mill's methods, then we have our basis for an inductive generalization. But now, with that said, I want to turn back now to what I had said was the first philosophical issue. What about the perception of actions do we actually perceive causality? We've exempted this issue, or freed this issue from the burden of having to prove that we do in order to justify induction, because we have the general law of causality in which we do observe that actions are dependent on entities. That's fine. That's clearly observable. And we have a method here that works by eliminating all but the relevant factors. In other words, let me stress that point a little more. This is essentially an eliminative method of establishing causality. What we're doing, we start not a lot of the philosophical discussion about induction starts with the point we observe a thing and having certain properties. We observe an effect. Now, how can we get them together? How can we get this effect and join it? Where's the glue? Where do we see the glue, or how do we prove that there's some causal glue in there? This standpoint that I'm representing as the Aristotelian objectivist position is the exact opposite. We know from the start that there's causality there as soon as we see a thing act. The question is, how do we eliminate the non-causal factors? We don't have to establish that there is a causal factor. The question is, how do we get rid of the irrelevant ones? Okay, it's an eliminative method rather than an aggregative method of induction. And if we have time, perhaps in the question period, I can elaborate a little more on that, because the Humean approach leads people to say, well, you just collect one instance after another. But this is the opposite. You eliminate possible factors. Okay, so point is, let's move on to the issue of whether or not we can perceive causality directly. Now, many people have accepted Hume's claim because they look at, even if they're not, if they accept the doctrine of sensationalism that we discussed yesterday, the idea that sensations are the basic level of cognition, that almost inevitably pushes you toward a Humean view that we do not see causality. But even those who do not accept that, who have a good, solid grasp that in the perception is a basic level, we start cognitively by perceiving entities and seeing their actions and attributes as dependent on the entities. Some people have said, well, okay, we see the action, but the causality is the relationship between the thing's attribute, like the heat of the flame and the burning of my finger when I put my finger near the flame. It's a relationship between one or more attributes of a thing and an action that it has engaged in. And we don't perceive that relationship over and above perceiving the things that are related, namely the entity and the action. But on the other hand, a number of philosophers have said, no, obviously we perceive causality. There are many ways in which we perceive not only the action, but the causal power or force by which the entity makes something happen. In a recent book published, I think it was last August, David Harriman and Leonard Peikoff put this into an objectivist, the context of the objectivist epistemology, and among other things, made the claim that we do perceive the causal relationship. We do perceive the making something happen, not just that it happens, but that something makes it happen. The example that Harriman uses is I roll a ball, okay, and the ball rolls because I rolled it. He was talking about children here. I couldn't find a good picture of babies rolling a ball, so I took a young woman bowling. But think if you've ever bowled, think about gripping the ball, and you take your stride, and you feel the weight of it, and you roll, and you know that ball is moving down the lane because you pushed it. You wound up and pitched it down there. So it's not just that you're aware of your arm's motion and you're aware of the ball proceeding down the lane toward the pins, but you're aware that you did it. That's the claim. Other examples that Harriman or other philosophers have used include such things as you see the leaves of a tree blowing in the wind. You feel the wind, and you can see the leaves blowing. You see the wind moving the leaves. It's not just the wind blowing and the leaves moving, but the wind is moving the leaves. Or you put a piece of paper into the fire, and you see the paper catch fire and turn into ashes. And you see the fire burning the paper. Other examples, you're splitting wood, you bring down the axe or the splitter, or you watch someone else doing it, you see the swing, the arc of it, and then you see the log flying to two pieces. At least sometimes. I've split a lot of wood in my day. This is a complicated causal transaction, actually. And I, for one, don't find this a particularly good example because I have swung an axe, actually, a splitter. You have to have a good wedge. And I always have to just wait and see whether the thing splits. But anyway, that never happens in movies. But you do a chord or two, and if I'm doing 60%, I'm doing well. In any case, one of the things that has struck me as I've read this literature is that people cite these examples. Those who see them as proving or illustrating, providing evidence that we perceive causality, just take it for granted. See the causality? Can you see it? I do. And others say, no, I don't see it. I just see the action. And I come back to that and say, okay, this is an issue on which actually I have gone back and forth during my reflections over the years about epistemology, and I would like to see an actual argument or analysis that would definitely push one way or the other. This is when intelligent people disagree on something that is being traced back to perception, whether you can see it or not. In some cases, I would say people who can't see it are just blind, or they're not getting it. Someone who doesn't get that existence exists. I can't go anywhere with that because that's so fundamental an axiom you can't prove it. But in the case of perceiving causality, the causal relationship, I've spent a lot of time thinking: is there anything that would establish it? Well, let me give you a couple examples of evidence that has been appealed to that at least will focus us on the most persuasive cases, the cases that most of those who are convinced seem to find most convincing. One is introspective evidence, our own agency. Rolling a ball. When I roll a ball, I not only see the motion that causes the ball to roll, and then the subsequent rolling of the ball, but I feel my own power. All right? I will to roll it. I roll it. My arm is moving. I feel my arm moving. I feel my arm giving the impetus to the ball. So there is the internal introspective evidence that we get from our own experience as agents who do things, who make things happen. Okay? As opposed to, I bumped into a ball and it started rolling. Oh, damn. That's a non-intentional action, and that's very different introspectively, phenomenologically. It's very different from an intentional action in which I am deliberately doing something and trying to make it happen. There are many cases of this, raising your arm, from raising your arm to, pushing the pedal to the floor and having the car go faster, and on up to through all the range of actions that we do and that we can observe from the inside as actions that we are intentionally doing. There are also cases of passive experience in which we are hit or something burns us. It's not that we're doing something, but something is doing something to us. So if if we look at being bumped into by somebody or hit by a ball that was thrown, being burned, being kissed, being tapped on the shoulder, all of these things, we in that case, we are not the agent, but the recipient. We are some sensory experience is the effect in this case, and we feel the force of whatever it is that's acting on us. So these have some plausibility to me, they have a degree of plausibility because of our introspective access to our intentional actions that seems stronger, at least to me, and I think this is plausible. These are very plausible examples. We have this introspective access gives us a sense of the causal power at work that is different from, we have access in a way that we don't have when we're observing an external causal transaction between, say, one billiard ball hitting another and the other one rolling off. However, because this is introspective and involves attending to one's own experience, there are also complications with this line of approach, because we have a limited amount of introspective access to what's actually going on when we act. All right, we're conscious of an intention, but we're not conscious of activity directly aware of what's going on in the motor cortex or in the nerves or in the animation of the activation of the muscles by the nerves. We don't feel the individual muscle fibers. We don't discriminate them one for another, and so on. So our access is limited, and also, there is a more general problem of how the mind and brain relate in the first place. How it is that our conscious awareness relates to the physical level and physiological level that on which our consciousness rests. We have it's not just a limited access, but what is introspective awareness? It seems to arise somewhere, somehow in the brain, and it is internal. Not only the awareness is not only up here, but the object I'm aware of is also up here. Unlike perception, where you're all perceiving that, the perception is in your head, but what you're perceiving is out here. So introspection has always been a more difficult mode of awareness to analyze than external perception. So, and I'll give you an example. I was wrestling with this. It's a personal anecdote. I was wrestling with this issue once. I think it was in college. It was some point in my studies, and I was reading some literature on this. And I was really absorbed in it. And I was just trying to figure it out, and how the will worked, and what was conscious and what wasn't. And so one morning after I woke up, and I had slept on my arm in such a way that my arm was asleep. And so I'm waiting there in bed, kind of for the blood to come back and the feeling to return, so I could start using this implement and get out of bed safely. And I had just been reading William James, so I said, all right, I won't go into James's theory, but I said, all right, let me just see. I'm going to start willing my finger to move. And I'm going to see if there's a difference at the point at which the arm has woken up enough for it to move. And lo and behold, I was willing, I was saying, I'm trying to make my finger move as hard as possible. And then gradually, at one point, it just moved. I thought, wow, that is interesting. I had no sense of internal difference between those two cases. It was just the one case, my hand was responding, was not responding, and then it just started responding. So the sense, when you begin looking at things like this, the plausibility and the persuasive power of the introspective kinds of examples has to be offset to some extent by the additional complications involved in our internal awareness of what we're doing. Let me turn now to another one. This is a set of experiments conducted in 1930s and 40s by a French psychologist named Albert Michaud, who published a book called The Perception of Causality. What he did was to set up experiments in like the following. You have two balls, and that's all you see. This is a very stripped down, impoverished stimulus. They do it now on computer screens. At the time, he didn't have computers, so he constructed these ingenious discs with a spiral slot, so he could make these round things appear to move. Okay, and what he did was to say, under what conditions of motion do you have the sense of a causal impact and a causal one ball making another happen? So here's an example. I constructed this one myself, just to keep it simple. And I can't be sure I got the timing right, but I certainly have the sense that what's going on here is one thing is rolling along or moving along, it hits the other, and the other moves off. It's a billiard ball collision. Okay? But now, what happens here? Okay? Just the difference in the slight time delay, it's less than a second. Most people have a sense, no, what happened was one ball moved along, touched the other, and then the other decided to move. Not so close. But without a direct sense of the first ball forcing the other one to move. Now, these experiments have been repeated thousands and thousands of times, varying every condition, varying the time gap. And once it gets to about 100 milliseconds, there's wide agreement that up to that among experimental subjects. If the gap is less than about 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second, people have a very strong impression that the first ball hit the second and made it move. push this second ball. They use, in describing what they see, they always use causal terms like that. But above about 100 milliseconds, they don't. They varied the direction of the angle at which the second ball moves off, and that too makes a difference. They varied the sizes of the balls and the speed at which, the relative speeds of the first ball and then the second. And there's an entire literature in which it's, they've established that with large agreement among observers, certain factors give rise to an impression of causality and certain factors don't. And it can be specified in fairly quantitative forms. The root of the issue, though, is this impression of causality. Now, Michaud himself was kind of a Humean in the sense that he didn't think we literally perceived these things. He thought the impression was internally generated as part of the perceptual mechanism. He was related to the Gestalt psychologist who said we impose various structural organizations on the raw data of our senses, and that structural organization comes from inside. This is similar to Hume in some ways, to Kant in other ways. So he was not a realist in that sense, at least that's my understanding of his position. He was a psychologist, so I'm not sure how precisely he was able to make the epistemological distinction, but that's the message I get. And of course, what's happening here is not a causal transaction. Okay, what you're watching are is a display on the screen, and there actually is no ball here rolling along, and there actually is no forcing of the second ball by the first. It's just you're observing a two-dimensional display that has been set up to look like a real thing in the world, but there's no actual. There's no causality here to be perceived because the actual cause of this was me. 2 days ago in the airplane, working on my PowerPoint. Okay, and I should include Microsoft in this. They had something to do with. They're in the causal chain too, but this first point of light is not one of the factors. However, that people have made much of the skeptics about perceiving causality have made much of this. I don't make much of it because the whole point of experimental work in perceptual psychology is precisely to try to isolate the relevant factors and conditions, which you do artificially, but what you're doing is reproducing the stimulus factors that in the real world, when we're perceiving the real world, you're trying to isolate which are the stimulus factors that are relevant to a given element in our perceptual awareness. Okay. So where do we go from here? I'm going to make some final observations. We're in the section I'm calling the conclusion. And I'll tell you how far I've gotten myself in thinking about this. And I hope this will be of some use and maybe stimulate some of your own thoughts. The first thing that I think it's important to emphasize is that when we ask, can we perceive causality, we are not looking for some third stuff or third quality that stands between the cause and the effect, between the object and the way it acts. Causality is a relationship, a connection between some aspect of a thing's nature and what it does. Causality isn't a third thing over and above the object and the action. It is the relationship between them. This is a problem whenever we're talking about relationships, relational factors in any kind of world. To give you a distant example, some people say, the problem with this couple is that their love is coming between them. And you think, well, literally, that's absurd. The love isn't a third agent here. It's not a threesome. It's still a twosome. It's just, and the love is only the relationship. But so it's a paradoxical statement. It names a real phenomenon, I think, that psychologists could elaborate on, and I'm glad to see we have some here. But people tend to reify or hypostatize, turn into another thing, a relationship between two things. One example of this that led some philosophers into a kind of cognitive black hole. It was a philosopher, I forget, it was one of the British idealists who made the following argument. Relationships, it can't be real because if they are real, okay, and there's a relationship between A and B, then we have to explain how A is related to the relationship and how the relationship is related to B. If the relationship is an actual existent thing, existent of any kind. Okay, and all right, so there's another level of relationships between A and the relationship and B. Oh, but how is that next level of relationship related to A? And you see the infinite regress that starts off. Well, that is a really stupid argument because it's the whole point of saying that they are related is that it's not another thing. It is an existent in the sense of the term that means anything that is present in reality. There are entities, there are attributes, there are relationships, there are actions. All of these can be called existence, ENTS. But it's not literally a thing that then has to be related. The relationship is the relationship. So when we look at causality, we don't have to. The issue whether we perceive causality is not whether we perceive another thing on top of the entity and the action. We have to think of it as a matter of, can we perceptually grasp that it is this feature making the action occur? And I think Michaud's examples are quite significant here because we can specify. I mean, you are grasping, not conceptually, you're observing, you're seeing that one time split between the object ball and the cue ball, the cue ball and the object ball is what makes the second one roll, and in the other case, you are observing that time difference. Your eyes are tracking it. Not that you could say what the time difference was in conceptual quantitative terms, but you are seeing it. And so there's a case to be made here that you are literally perceiving the feature, not only the feature of velocity and contact, but the connection between that velocity and that degree of that time lag of contact and the effect. There's a second point that I'd want to make. So the first point is the causal power, the causal power of a thing to act in a certain way or to make other things act in a certain way is not a separate attribute. It is a relational phenomenon. The question is whether we can isolate the two terms of the relationship, the feature of the thing and the effect, and clearly as related. The second point I want to make is that one of the issues in the philosophy of perception is how do we identify or how do we specify what actually is the object of awareness? For many years, and let me go back to some of the more elementary types of examples that philosophers have always talked about. We see an object like, well, take me for an example. Since I think I have most of your attention, most of yours attention. there's a question, do you see a three-dimensional object or do you see only a surface? Because you actually don't see the back of my shirt. Most of you. And there are principled reasons why I would claim, and did claim in my book, no, you see the object. Why? Because you see depth behind me. You see a depth contrast, not just a change in a two-dimensional color scheme in front of your eyes. You see the texture of, as I move slightly, you see the visual texture being revealed on this side and occluded on this side as I move. You know, the stripes of the wallpaper are, there are slight variations there as I'm moving like that, which is another aspect of perceiving depth, but also of perceiving that I am a moving thing. And of course, as I turn slightly, you see more parts are revealed visually and others are then hidden. So you always perceive the edge of the two-dimensional, what a painter would put down as a two-dimensional. You always see that edge as simply the limit of vision, not the limit of the object. So that's a good principal reason for saying that the actual object of perception, visual perception, is normally, outside special laboratory setups, the object of perception is the three-dimensional thing, not a two-dimensional screen. Or to take another example, we hear speech. Okay? Now, the speech is being produced by my vocal apparatus. What actually are you hearing? Are you hearing the sound? Or are you hearing what makes the sound? That is, the movement of my lips and larynx and tongue. Well, in that case, it seems clear. How do we answer that question? Since perception is essentially the discrimination of entities, the question is, what are you discriminating from what when you hear me speak or hear anyone speak? You're discriminating words, right? You're discriminating the alterations in the pitch and timbre, the pauses and the sounds. That's what you're hearing. So you're not discriminating the motion of my tongue as I speak. Now, that is, if I ask you, okay, define, tell me what you're hearing. Which way do you hear my tongue moving right now? Okay. You couldn't answer that. Even if you know perfectly well, and even if you can see my tongue, I don't want to get this. May be not a good example. It's getting a little too personal. But now I had a speech teacher once, a coach, and she literally could. I would say something, I would be doing an exercise, and she said, "Oh, don't keep your teeth so close together." Or, I hear the sound, I hear your throat closing. And after a while, I had to believe her, because she made me aware of things that, even introspectively, I'd never noticed before. So that's a case where it's the same thing is happening. A speaker is making sounds. In most cases, in 99.9% of the cases, what others are hearing is sound rather than the physical motion. Whereas when I hear a car crash, okay, I am hearing one thing hitting another. I'm not just hearing some noise. Okay. So let's apply that question then to the perception of causality. What actually do we perceive? In the Michaud kinds of examples, or the billiard ball examples that go back to Hume and probably earlier, what we observe, one set of terms that I've used, I'm not, I hope this is accurate and scientifically accurate. What we observe are the kinematic properties, that is, the motion properties, the speed, direction of the objects that are moving. The question is whether through perceiving that, we also perceive the dynamic properties. That is, the momentum, the force, the energy that is actually, as we know now, thanks to Newtonian physics, is what makes the object ball move off. And I think that just as in it seems very plausible to me that just as in the case of the speech teacher's example that I was using, probably most of the time what we're observing is the kinematic features, the observable motions and velocities. But that when things are set up, the reason we have such a strong impression of causality in the first case is that we are perceiving. We have maybe a learned kind of perception, but it's not conceptual. We've actually, our eyes have learned to detect the in this case what we would identify conceptually, scientifically, as the momentum of the first ball. Another case or another aspect that it falls under this general heading of what it actually is the object of perception. We see salt dissolve in water. As I was saying before, that tells us that it is soluble. But what makes it soluble? That's what we call a dispositional term. It says this thing has the capacity or tendency to do this. So we're just defining a certain attribute. There's something about it we're not saying that gives it makes it act this way. But then we have to find out what that power is, and we now know from chemistry that it has to do with the bonds among the molecules. The bonds that join the sodium and chloride can be broken by water. So, but obviously we don't perceive the atoms. We don't perceive the bond. In that case, what we just see is the salt disappear. We could still say the water is making the salt disappear, right? And that is a surface level causal grasp, which then gives us our assignment as scientists. Why is that happening? So I don't think we have to say that you have to see the ions. Whatever we see, there's always something behind it at the microscopic level that is we now know, thanks to science, underlies and explains the property that we do grasp. But in some cases, like the solubility, I think all I can have any impression of observing is there's the water, here's the salt disappears. Water making salt disappear, all I can do is gather instances. That if I put it in water, it disappears. If I put it in scrambled eggs, it doesn't disappear. I can still see it on the surface until it dissolves more slowly, or until I eat it. And that's an instance of the third point I want to make. Causality is a relationship, and there's another relationship that we have access to at the perceptual level that is extremely important and in some ways I think similar, and that is the relationship of similarity. The whole theory of concepts that Ayn Rand came up with is based on the fact that at the perceptual level we can grasp the similarity between things like two chairs or two tables or two people. But how do we grasp that similarity? It's because through a structured awareness of the greater similarity between two chairs versus the more distant similarity of either chair to the table, or really the difference. The similarity of the two chairs to each other stands out against the difference that they both have from the table. If we were just seeing the two chairs, we'd see them as different. I mean, we happen to be in a hotel room where all the chairs are identical to vision. So, the table and chair example, I don't know why I keep using it, because, 8 times out of 10 when I'm explaining this, I'm in a hotel room with the same phenomenon. But no, seriously, if you imagine a child in a house, okay, the chairs, there may be some matching sets, but there are a lot of chairs around. The point is, we grasp the similarity despite the visible differences between the chairs, because they are more like each other than they are to the table. So here we have another example of a perception of a structured set. Okay, and it's the structural properties of the set, the lesser difference between the chairs than the difference between either chair and the table, that constitutes the perceptual awareness of the similarity. And so going back to Mill's methods, I pointed out earlier that when we do a controlled experiment using one of a method of agreement or of difference, what we have is a single structured set of cases, and that we see, and it's by the nature of that structure, the presence or absence of a factor, the presence or absence of the effect, that we establish the causality. Well, in some cases, I think the way in which we see causality is through the perception of something like a Mill's method setup. This is an example. Okay, I do this, and that, and of course I could do it much faster, and I could do it on simultaneous displays, and those contrasts are what give us the logical evidence of causality. But when we're observing something like these displays, what we are not just using cases, we are actually perceiving the cases and perceiving them within the same frame of perceptual attention in such a way that I think the contrast counts as giving us the awareness of the causal relationship. It's not, just as similarity is not another thing that stands between two similar objects, but it is the fact that their properties have a certain degree of difference as opposed to a larger degree of difference. That's actually a fairly complex relational fact, but there's no reason we can't perceive it, and we obviously do perceive it in the case of similarity. And I think I'd like to, this is a thought I've just had and haven't fully explored, but I think some of the issues about whether or not we can perceive causality could be resolved by thinking of it more in this way: as we perceptually isolate the factor that's making the effect happen, because we are in the same circumstance able to see the absence of the factor connected with the non-effect. Okay, or that would be using the perceptual equivalent of the method of difference. All right, so just to wrap up, I'm taking a little more time because Fred asked me to just stay on for use part of the next session because of Barbara's accident. So I'm just going to wrap up now and then break for questions. What I hope I've illuminated is the fundamental role of causality in our grasp of the world and all of our cognitive functioning, all the way down to the perceptual level. The fact that the general law of causality is established on perceptual grounds in the way that other axiomatic features of our world, like existence and identity, are established, directly perceived, and we simply grasp that there's nothing peculiar to this particular case. Existence isn't different no matter what I'm perceiving. Identity isn't different as a fact no matter what kind of thing I'm perceiving, and causality is not different regardless of what particular actions I'm observing. It's a general feature of our world, and therefore the problem of induction goes away, so that the issue of whether we perceive causality is not an essential ingredient in the so-called validation of induction or justification of induction. But it is an interesting perceptual issue, and highly relevant to the way we form concepts for causality at the basic level. And although I think the evidence is mixed, I'm inclined to agree that we do perceive causality in certain cases, but you have to do a lot more to establish that than simply to cite cases as obvious. Just look and see. So with that, I'm going to draw this to a close. Thank you for your attention, and we'll... And I guess Fred, you want to take a break and come back for questions, or do questions?
15 minutes, so I have a little extended break.
All right.
Okay. More questions?
Okay. Okay, interesting question to start. Thank you. Animals act as if they perceive causality. Doesn't that imply it's perceptible in some cases? Well, yes. Clearly, animals function through being able to act in a world that is full of causal relationships, many of which are vital to their survival, and that all they have is a perceptual level. I take this as the kind of the in principle argument. Since they don't have concepts, but they are aware of causality, how could they not be aware of it perceptually? To which I'd say that's an interesting point, and I'm going to have to think about it a bit more. But for now, let me just say the perceptual level is not simply the actual act of perceiving an object in the types of cases we use as examples. The perceptual level includes all manner of perceptual memories, of perceptual associations. As you move up from the lower orders up to mammals and primates, what animals do cognitively, it can be very sophisticated. Even if you hold, and as I would, that they do not literally have conceptual capacities, they certainly have sophisticated associationistic capacities to recognize kin, to recognize predators, and act toward them with not only perceiving and responding to what they see, but anticipating. And we know that this is still perceptual level. We should not a priori or by arbitrary assumption think that perception has to be literally just what happens in this 1 second of time. Or perception is a continuous process, and it involves, just think of an outfielder running for a ball, okay, a fly ball. He's learned to anticipate where the ball is going to come down, and what he's doing is not performing complex mathematical calculations in his head to track a parabolic arc of the ball. He's not literally solving equations from initial inputs on speed and direction. No, his eyes are tracking it, and it's an anticipatory mode of perception. And animals do that to extraordinary powers in many cases. So the perceptual level is highly complex, and I think animals are certainly capable at the perceptual level of perceiving complex structural properties in just the way that I was arguing we do. But I think that is a very good point to keep in mind as against any thesis that we grasp causality only conceptually. It does seem to me like a good argument against that view. All right. Okay. There are some questions here on a specific and a general one. How does consequence or unintended consequence relate to causality? Well, any consequence is an effect and implies a cause. whether it's intended or not. That distinction, intended versus unintended, applies only to humans, or at least only to conscious beings that are capable of having intentions. So that's a question about whether the effect was caused in part and explained, at least in part, by the intention or by something else. So that's a question about the specific causality, not about causality as such. There's another question here, and this maybe is an opportunity to clarify some of the terminology that we use in philosophy. Are motion, agency, and interaction properly described as attributes of an object? Why not? Are attributes then contextual? I'm not too sure about the second part, but let me deal with the first one. When we talk about entities, we employ categories, metaphysical categories, and the way of looking at things goes back to Aristotle, at least, who actually wrote a book called The Categories. What are the fundamental kinds of things that are in the world? There are entities. He called them substances. We call them things or whatever. And then they have natures, and we can isolate different aspects of their natures. And we sometimes use the word attribute or feature in the broadest possible way to mean anything, any specific isolated aspect of a thing's nature, whether it's a self-contained quality or a relationship or an action. But you have to establish at the beginning, there are a number of terms that we use to designate features like color, shape, size, texture, composition, structure, things that are features of the object apart from all other objects and apart from what it does. And we call these qualities or properties or sometimes attributes. See, all these terms, what you have to do if you're going to talk about this is at the beginning lay out which terms you're going to use for what. So in that sense, there is a contextual element to of it. That is, you need to have the context of your own concepts and language very clear in trying to isolate these things. But that is to a certain extent boils down to a semantic issue. There are good reasons for distinguishing actions from relationships from, let me say, qualities. To what extent does what we perceive depend on what we're looking for? That is, words versus tongue movements. A lot. Perception is not a passive cognitive operation. There is a passive element to it in that we do not construct the object in the way, or put it together by some cognitive process. We open our eyes and what we see is what's there. Or we take our hands off our ears and what we hear is whatever ambient sound and sounding objects that happen to be in our environment. However, we are animals. We have senses for a reason. They serve a purpose, and we use them for that purpose, and that involves looking, attending, hearing. So when you walk into your room and you're looking for your keys, okay? That's a very different perceptual experience from walking into your room and saying, "Where's the gin?" Or I really just want to lie down. All of these you're entering the same room. In some way, your visual experience is you're getting the same input, but what you are looking for is what determines how you're functioning. Having said that, it's very important to stress, as against certain modes of Kantian argumentation, that the activity involved in perception is not the activity of constructing an object, but of selecting among all the possible things that you could focus on. It's all there. You're not making it up just because you, on one occasion, focus in one way and on another occasion in another way. Okay.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.